All right guys, so on today's field tips, we're gonna be making some extreme FOC arrows with bamboo shafts, so stick with us. All right, so like I'd mentioned, we're gonna be using bamboo shafts today. Now, in a future video, I'm gonna be making some higher FOC arrows with Sitka spruce footed with hardwood. So if you're not subscribed to the channel and you wanna catch that video, go ahead and subscribe so that you don't miss it when I upload that one. But for this video, we're gonna be using bamboo. Now, there's a couple of key differences between wood shafts and bamboo shafts. One big difference is that bamboo doesn't have a grain orientation like wood does. And what I mean by grain orientation is, in the context of arrows, is the growth rings. Now, when you make wood arrows, you want to have those growth rings oriented so that when your arrow is on the bowstring, that those growth rings are perpendicular to the bow. Now, since bamboo is a natural shoot, it doesn't have that growth ring structure. And so what that means in the arrow making process is there's no specific way that this shaft has to be oriented. Now, this can be to our advantage if we want to really make a consistent and tightly matched group of arrows. Now, I'm going to be using a spine tester in this video, and I'll just make mention of this real quick. A spine tester, these things are really kind of expensive for what they are. All they really do is measure the deflection of the shaft or how stiff the shaft is. But if you're going to be making your own arrows and you're going to be making a lot of arrows and you're concerned with how well matched they are, they are expensive, but they really are worth it to have and to be able to match your shafts. So enough about that. So what I'm going to do, first thing I'm going to do is go through and weigh all my shafts. And I've got just a little grain scale here that I got from Three Rivers. I go through there, make sure that they're all within a pretty close range, so plus or minus 10 grains or so of grain weight. Now, with bamboo, you can actually adjust the weight a little bit because they are hollow. That's the other big difference between bamboo and wood. They are hollow, and so you can add things inside these shafts. You can take a little drill bit and drill these out and add little number 8 shot if you want to. You can add little nails and things like that. So you can really adjust the weight on these shafts. But if you order shafts in bulk, or if you order them from a supply house that actually will go through and grain weight match, you don't have to worry about all that stuff. So back to matching them in spine. Now, I'm going to put this thing on my spine tester and I'm going to zero it out. Then I'm going to hang my weight on there and just see what this thing spines at. Now, this one is 65 pounds and that's exactly what I want. But the good thing about bamboo is you can actually rotate these things to fine adjust the spine. So let's take, all right, before I take this off, what I'm going to do is take a Sharpie, because 65 pounds is exactly what I want for this shaft. So I'm going to take my Sharpie and put a dot right on top of that shaft. Now that's going to come in handy here in a little bit. So I'm going to set that one down and I'm going to put my next shaft up there. I'm going to re-zero. I'm going to hang my weight. Hot dog, that one's 65 as well. So I'm going to, again, I'm going to make another mark. I'm going to put that one down. Put my next shaft up there, re-zero, hang the weight. All right, so this one is spining actually a little above 65. It's more like 67. So this really isn't a huge deal, but a few pounds difference in spine will actually make a difference in where your arrow strikes on the target. So long as you have your back tension in your form and your release and all that dialed in, you can actually see a little bit of difference if you're a fairly good shot. You can see the difference in a few pounds of spine. And so what I'm going to do is take my weight off And I'm just gonna rotate this shaft just a little bit, re-zero my spine tester, and then hang my weight again. All right, so that brought the spine weight down a little bit. It's not quite to 65, and so I'm gonna rotate it a little bit more, re-zero, and there it is. That is 65 pounds on the nose. So now I'm gonna put my mark up there so that I know where the spine was measured from. Now, the reason that I'm making these marks on this shaft is because I know now where the spine was measured, and so when I put my nock on here, I'm gonna have that dot. So right now, the dot is on this side of the arrow. So I'm gonna cut my nock in like this, so that the way I measured the spine, it's gonna be deflecting around the bow's riser like this. Now, I'm a right-handed shooter, of course. If you're left, it's gonna be opposite. But by rotating those shafts, you can really get your spines very, very closely matched. All right, so I'd mentioned that bamboo is hollow. Now, for these shafts, I'm actually gonna cut in self nocks. Now, I'm not gonna go through the entire process of making self nocks. I've actually got another video that shows you exactly how to do that. But before I cut in my nocks, I'm gonna go ahead and plug the ends of these shafts. Now, I've got a drill bit that is just a little bit smaller than 1/8 of an inch. It's actually will fit perfectly one of these bamboo shish kebab skewers. And so what I'm gonna do is go ahead drill out the end of this shaft, and then I'm just gonna glue one of these shish kebab skewers in there, and I'm gonna put it in there with super glue. Now, if you want to put plastic nocks on here, you can certainly do it. You need to plug this hole first so that when you taper this out on your taper tool, you don't have a hole in the center. Now, if you try to taper it without plugging it like this, where that taper comes down to that hole, it's gonna get real fine and feathery, and it's actually gonna crush a little bit. But if you'll go ahead and plug it with one of these shish kebab skewers, you can taper these things out just like any other wood shaft. Now, I will tell you that if you're using a taper tool, or if you have a taper tool like this, which is a blade cutting taper tool, these don't work very well for bamboo if you're using bamboo shafts. You really need a taper tool that works on a sanding disc. And I've got one over here, and I've actually got another video that shows you how to make the taper tool that I use. Or you can just get one that'll attach to a commercial belt sander. You can actually buy a taper tool like that from some of the archery supply stores. But once you've got this, once you've got them plugged, like I said, you can just treat them like any other shaft. Now, if you are gonna use self nocks, you do need to wrap in front of the nock with either thread or a piece of sinew. And what I do is just wrap it with sinew, and I put a little dab of Tight Bond, and then take a piece of sinew and a pretty fine thread of sinew and just wrap right in front of that nock. And it doesn't take much, you know, 1/4 inch or so of flat wrapped sinew is plenty. That'll keep it from splitting. And I don't even worry about putting a 1/2 hitch in it or anything. I just wrap it and then make sure that there's plenty of glue around it, and then set that in the sun and let it dry. All right, so our sinew that we wrapped around the nock is dry. Now I'm gonna go ahead and just put this in my fletching jig. Now when I put it in the fletching jig, the first fletch that I'm gonna put on here is my odd fletch. So I'm gonna do 1 natural turkey feather and 2 commercial feathers. Now, I want to put this thing in there so that my dot that I marked when it was on my spine tester is up. So that dot is going to correspond with my cock feather or my odd fletch. So go ahead and stick that in there. Put your fletch in your and your clamp. Actually, before I do that, I'm gonna take and trim the very front of this quill into a point. And now I'll put it into my fletching clamp. And I'm lining it up. I like my fletchings to be pretty far back on my arrow, so when I have my string or my fingers on the string, the fletching is right in front of my finger. I don't like to have them very far up the shaft. The farther back they are, the more leverage they're going to have on the arrow and the more steering capabilities they have. But go ahead and just put you a good bead of glue on there. And this, what I'm using here is bonding Fletch Tight. Go ahead and so that needs to stay in the clamp for 5 minutes before you take that off, and then you can rotate it and put your next clamp on there. And then before you actually shoot the arrows, you need to let it sit around for at least a day or so. All right, so I've got a couple of arrows that have been sitting around for a day, and the fletching glue is completely cured out. Now I'm ready to trim these feathers. Now, I'm gonna trim them with a feather burner. You don't have to use a feather burner. You can trim them by hand if you want to. I like a feather burner just because you can shape this wire any way that you want to. Now, I've got my feathers, or I've got this thing shaped so that it's pretty much a straight cut from the back to the front. And compared to, there's a lot of smoke. Compared to a lot of other traditional arrows, I shoot pretty small fletchings. Now, the reason that I can get away with small fletchings like this is because I spend time tuning my arrows to my bow, and I've got a pretty in-depth video going through that whole process about how I tune these arrows to fly perfectly from my bows. And actually, the way that I tune them, I could strip the feathers completely off of them and they still will fly perfectly. And so when you have your feathers tuned like that, or your arrows tuned like that, you need very little guidance from the fletchings. The other reason that I'm able to get away with small fletchings like this is because I am building high FOC arrows. And so the farther you push up that front of center, the farther you push that weight forward, the more leverage your feather end has on the steering capabilities. And so when you shoot a high FOC arrow, you can really get away with running small fletchings like this. Now, in regard to the fletching size, I had a comment on my Patreon site from Steve Lardner, and he was asking, what do I consider big fletchings? He was saying that his fletchings are 5 inches long by 3/4 inches high, and they're elliptical shape. Now, that's pretty standard for a lot of traditional shooters, but with good, well-tuned arrows and a higher FOC, it's totally overkill. These arrows, by comparison, are 4 inches long, and they're less at the rear here. They're less than 1/2 inch, and it's pretty much a straight taper. And so I'm probably, as far as surface area goes, I'm probably half what most traditional shooters are shooting. All right, so the next thing that I need to do is just go ahead and trim all of my arrows to length. Now, the length that I cut my arrows isn't just dependent on my draw length. It's actually a length that I've settled on through tuning. And like I said, I've got a whole video that covers that, but I've got an arrow here, a bare shaft, no fletchings, that I took through the tuning process, and this one is flying absolutely perfect from my bow. It's got a 190 grain tip on it, and it's cut to the proper length so that it flies straight when it comes out of my bow. Now, what I'm gonna do is just take this bare shaft that's flying perfectly from my bow, and I'm gonna take the tip off of it so that I can get an accurate length on the measurement, and then I'll use that length to trim the rest of my arrows. That one's already trimmed. Now when you're trimming these bamboo shafts, you need to be careful about it, because if you take a big saw or something and try to cut these off, you're probably going to make them splinter because of those little fibers that are running up and down. The way I usually trim them is with a razor blade, and I'll just go around the shaft and score it all the way around, and then just keep going around to kind of cut those fibers. And once you score it, then you can usually break them off. A little bit of back and forth pressure and pop. All right, so now that I've got it trimmed, what I want to do is go ahead, just like we did on the nock end, and I want to fill that in with a shish kebab skewer. Find one that fits right. That's pretty good. Put a little bit of super glue in there so that it sits in there tight. And then we'll let that dry before we taper. You can break that off. We'll let that dry before we put our tip taper on there. All right, so before I put my point taper on here, I'm just gonna go ahead and square the end up on this thing. And now I've got my taper tool set to my point taper, so I'm just gonna go ahead and set it on there and start tapering. So if you're tapering these things for field tips, you want to leave a little over about 1/8 of an inch or so. If you taper it too far, it's going to hit the end of the field tip once you get it up in there, and then it's going to rock on the shaft. So leave them a little more blunt for field tips. I'm going to put broadheads on these, so I'm going to run that taper on out a pretty good bit. So before I put any of my tips on there, broadheads, field tips, or whatever, I like to take a little point brush and just run them up in here. And what that does is clean out any kind of oils or anything in the inside of these tips, and it scores the inside of it. And it really, if you have trouble with your points pulling off in targets and things like that, using that little point brush makes all the difference in the world. You can take one of these points and really, after you score it with that, shove that thing on there, and it's hard to get off without any glue at all. It's really amazing what those things do. So we'll go ahead and put the broadheads on here. Just take a little bit of Ferrite, heat it up, and smear it on the end of the shaft there. You don't need a lot of glue. Now with these cane shafts, they're pretty small diameter, and most of the broadheads that you're going to get are going to have bigger ferrules than the shaft diameter. Now that's one of the reasons that I like to take the point taper down pretty good ways on these bamboo shafts is because some of these broadheads with the really long ferrules like these are from Toughhead. If you make your point taper long, it just helps to center those shafts, or center that broadhead onto the shaft, and helps them to spin true. And when you're heating your broadheads up like this, just be careful not to heat them too much and take the temper out of those blades. You know, especially if you're doing it with a propane torch or something like that. But I personally like to have my broadhead so that when my bow is on the string, my broadhead is laying flat. So I'll line this thing up with my odd fletch and just give it a good push on there. And then I've got a little alignment jig here that I made where I can just make sure that everything is spinning true, but that looks really good. Get any excess glue off of there. And then what I do is just dip it in a little thing of water to cool it off so that it sets the glue. And there you have it. Probably 20% FOC. It's a killer. So the trick for getting extreme FOC in a natural material arrow is to find lightweight shafts and then put a heavy head on the front. You can get to extreme FOC, you can get above 18-20% FOC in any wood shaft if you put enough weight on the front, but the problem is you're gonna end up with an arrow that weighs like 700 or 800 grains, and you know, for me, that's just too heavy. You know, for short shots, you know, 5, 10, 15 yards, you'll probably be fine. But when you start stretching that distance out a little bit, your trajectory just, your arc is way too much. And me being a gap shooter, it makes your distance estimation absolutely critical. I mean, if you're off just a yard or two, you know, you could be missing by 6 or 8 inches. And so I like to keep my arrows around 550 to 600 grains. And to do that with these arrows and these broadheads, these shafts started off around right at about 400 grains, and this is a 190 grain head. And so through trimming this shaft back, you know, adding the fletchings, adding the head and everything, right now this total arrow weight is about 560 grains, which for me is perfect. The FOC is up probably about 20% or so. Now, one thing I would like to mention about natural shoot shafting, like these bamboo shafts, is that someone that's used to shooting carbon or aluminum or even a well-made wood shaft might look down these things and say, man, those things look really irregular. And they are, kind of. There are, you know, they have nodes, there's little bumps, there's little undulations, but as long as the arrow is straight from nock to tip, those little bumps and little undulations don't matter one bit. I can tune one of these arrows to be just as accurate as the best made carbon arrow out there, and I will challenge anybody to dispute that. One of the big reasons that all these little bumps and things don't matter is that with a well-tuned bow and arrow, this arrow should not come in contact with the riser once it's being shot, or once you drop the string. Once you drop the string, this thing flexes away from the riser and it doesn't come in contact with the bow again. And so as long as it's straight, as long as it spins true, natural shoot shafting can be very, very accurate. All right, guys, so that's gonna wrap us up for this week's video. As I've said before, if you're not subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do it, because I'm uploading a new video every week. And then also check out the Patreon site. I get a lot of questions from people who have no idea what Patreon is. All it is a membership site where you can go, doesn't cost very much, you can sign up for whatever level you want, and you get exclusive content. You get videos on bow building, you get little tips that I'm in here when I'm working on something in the shop that I put up when I have bow building lessons. If we run into a particular problem, I'll put up a little video on there. And all that stuff is just on Patreon. You're not gonna see that on YouTube. So if you want access to that extra exclusive content, just go over there and check it out. I guarantee if you're into bow building or traditional archery, you're probably gonna find something that piques your interest. So go over there and check it out. But with that, if it's not elk season yet, it's just about there. I'm not sure when this video is gonna come out, but I've got things to do. So we'll see you next time.